The morning air in Kaktovik carried a silence that wasn't natural. Not the hush of snow, not the pause before a storm, but something sharper like a missing heartbeat. Out on the ragged edge of the Beaufort Sea, the ice itself seemed restless. Cracks spidered under the weight of shifting currents. Pressure ridges rose like frozen walls. A mother polar bear emerged, her breath steaming her massive shoulders slick with frost, but she wasn't scanning for seals. Her head turned side to side, searching for cubs that weren't there. Only a few paw prints trailed across the snow, leading toward a fracture in the flow and ending abruptly at the waterline. Eleanor, a wildlife responder from Anchorage, had her binoculars pressed so hard to her face that they left red circles on her skin. She whispered into her radio voice tight, "No cubs in sight." Tracks disappear at the lead. On the observation ridge beside her, James, a fourth-grade teacher volunteering with a student citizen science group, felt his stomach knot. The kids back home had written questions for him to ask on this trip. How do polar bear mothers keep their babies safe? What happens when the ice melts too soon? He thought he'd have gentle answers about dens and hunting. Now he wasn't sure what to say. What Eleanor and James witnessed was no longer rare. Arctic scientists recorded every spring cubs are separated when sea ice fractures earlier than expected. Polar bears depend on stable ice platforms to hunt seals and teach their young. When that ice breaks apart under storm winds or shifting currents, cubs can tumble into leads, become stranded on smaller floes, or vanish without a trace. Unlike grizzlies, polar bears don't carry their young in dens once they emerge. On the open ice, every crack is a potential trap. The camera drone circled above, feeding live images to the base station. From above, the scene was haunting tiny tracks ending where dark water met the flow. The mother circled back and forth, her nose working furiously, chest heaving with low grunts that carried farther than any radio call. To anyone watching her search was more than instinct. It was grief in motion. The first action is almost always restraint. As Eleanor explained to James, rescuers can't simply step in and scoop cubs off the ice. Under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, intervention happens only when cubs are in clear distress and have no chance of survival. Handling them too soon or bringing human scent into the reunion can cause a mother to reject her own offspring. That's the paradox. Sometimes the most compassionate choice is to stand still and let nature write its next line. But standing still feels unbearable when a mother paces the edge of loss. James thought about how back home his students would want a story with a happy ending. The rangers found the cubs, the family was safe, everyone clapped. He wanted that too. Yet what he was learning out here was harder and truer. In the wild, hope isn't a guarantee. It's a discipline. For the audience watching this unfold on screen later, it's easy to see only the mother bear and imagine the pain. But Eleanor's steady narration added context. She described how polar bear cubs are born weighing barely 1 pound, blind and helpless in snow dens insulated against Arctic winds. By spring, they've grown to 20 or 30 pounds, full of clumsy energy, but still unable to survive alone. One misstep near thin ice can erase an entire year's investment of a mother's effort. That's why her behavior, sniffing, circling, chuffing, isn't random. She's using olfactory memory mapping where her cubs last touched the ice. A lesson emerged in the rhythm of her search. Even in panic, she worked systematically. Wide circle, sniff, pause, adjust, backtrack. It was the same principle trainers use with service dogs when teaching scent detection method matters more than speed. James scribbled this in his field notebook, underlining it twice. Later, when his students asked why the mother didn't just run everywhere, he would explain that survival, whether for bears or humans, requires discipline in the face of chaos. There's also a small mystery here, one that gives the story its weight. Polar bears are built for loss. Cubs vanish to storms, to starvation, to predators. Yet mothers keep searching long past the point where humans would give up. Why biologists debate whether it's instinct or attachment. The truth is likely both. For the bear, persistence isn't sentiment, it's strategy. For us, watching it becomes something else, a mirror. James felt that mirror keenly. A decade earlier, when his own mother died, suddenly he remembered standing in her empty kitchen opening cupboards as though she might be hiding inside. The motion was absurd yet unstoppable. Now, watching the bear paw the snow where tracks had ended, he recognized the same refusal to accept absence. He whispered, "I know." And Eleanor, though she hadn't heard him, lowered her binoculars and whispered the same word. For viewers in their living rooms, especially those who've lost children, spouses, or even pets, this moment lands heavy. It says, "Your grief is understood even in the Arctic." It reminds us that loss is not uniquely human, and neither is endurance. That recognition alone can heal something raw in those who watch. What's crucial is how the scene sets up what comes next. Because while the ice carried its silence, the radio at Eleanor's hip crackled with a new report: thermal hit near Ridge 20. Possible movement. Suddenly, standing still was no longer the rule. The responders would need to read the ice like a book, distinguishing shadow from life, crack from trail, and deciding whether to intervene at all. Before the camera shifts to that search, let's pause for a fresh perspective. Too often we hear stories of polar bears only as statistics: population decline, habitat loss, climate, victim. Numbers numb us. But a mother pacing a flow for her missing cubs, this changes the conversation. It moves us from charts to character, from data to devotion. That shift is what sparks action in viewers who may never set foot on Arctic ice, but can still change the forces shaping it through choices, donations, votes, and conversations at their own kitchen tables. In a way, the missing cubs on the ice also foreshadow the missing pieces in our own communities. Just as neighbors may notice a struggling family or an abandoned pet but say, "Someone else will handle it," many towns overlook warning signs until it's too late. The mother bear reminds us that attention must be immediate, personal, and unrelenting. She doesn't assume another bear will do the work. She owns the search. That's the lesson compassion doesn't outsource. As the drone tilted its lens, catching a streak of white movement near the ridge, Eleanor's breath caught. James scribbled one last note. The hardest part of rescue is knowing when to wait and when to act. And with that, the story shifted. From vanishing tracks to the question every viewer leans forward to ask, what happens when the search truly begins? The silence on the ice was broken not by an answer, but by a lead. And as the rescuers prepared to follow their own histories, William with his scars, Margaret with her quiet persistence, James with his classroom questions, were about to collide with the bear's story. The vanishing tracks had set the stage. The next act would reveal what kind of people choose to follow them. On the wind-scoured bluff above the ice, Eleanor adjusted the strap of her parka and tried not to think about the weight of her badge. It wasn't just plastic and photo ID. To her, it was a promise to respond when lives hung in the balance, whether those lives had 2 legs or 4. She leaned into the binoculars again, scanning for the faintest flicker of white against white. James, standing beside her, fumbled with his field notebook. He wasn't trained like Eleanor. He wasn't even supposed to be here, except that the science program had invited him as a community partner, someone who could take the story home to a classroom. He was used to children's questions, the kind that tumble out faster than answers. Why do polar bears live on ice? Do they have friends? Do cubs play tag? But now his hands shook. He had no simple words for what they had seen, tracks vanishing into dark water, a mother searching with eyes that seemed almost human. Not far away inside the station's prefabricated cabin, William sat by the radio console. His Marine medals were boxed up somewhere he hadn't opened in years, but his posture still carried the gravity of service. His partner now wasn't another soldier, but a German shepherd named Lady, retired from canine work. Even at 10 years old, she shadowed him like it was still deployment. He reached down, fingers brushing the ridge of scar tissue along her shoulder. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though his own pulse was anything but easy. William had learned the hard way that healing isn't silence, it's structure. Lady had pulled him through panic nights more than once, nudging him awake when nightmares clawed too deep, grounding him with the steady pressure of her body across his legs. He'd promised her, after both of them retired, that he would spend his last years making sure no partner, animal or human, was abandoned. That promise had drawn him north. The presence of these three, Eleanor, James, William, gave the polar bear story its human mirror. Without them, viewers would see only an animal drama. With them, the ice became a stage where human duty, grief and loyalty played out alongside a mother bear's search. Eleanor carried the burden of decision-making. She explained to James why rescue was complicated. Every action we take has to pass 3 tests. Can it help? Will it harm? And is it even legal? She described the Marine Mammal Protection Act like a shield meant to protect, but heavy to hold. Sometimes the hardest part of wearing a badge is realizing it's not permission to save everything. James scribbled that line down. For his students, he knew it would land. Children imagine heroes always rushing in. They don't picture a hero watching, waiting, documenting. He remembered his own father, a volunteer firefighter, once saying, "Restraint saves more lives than adrenaline." At the time, James had rolled his eyes. Now, watching Eleanor measure each breath, he finally understood. Meanwhile, William had his own ghosts to wrestle. PTSD was a word that sounded clinical in brochures. In reality, it was the way the smell of diesel on cold air could yank him back decades, or how a slammed door could undo months of progress. Lady had been the constant that kept him tethered. Even now, when static on the radio made his chest tighten, Lady pressed against his knee until he steadied. To outsiders, she was just a dog. To Willia, she was oxygen with pause. This parallel mattered. As viewers, we often rank animal suffering as distant, something separate from our own scars. But here, William's partnership with Lady blurred that line. His life had been saved by a working dog. The bear's cubs might only live if their mother could keep doing her job. Loyalty is not just sentiment, it's survival. To illustrate, Eleanor recalled a case from a year earlier. A polar bear cub had been spotted alone near Point Barrow, circling trash bins. The public clamored for immediate intervention. "Why aren't you rescuing it?" people demanded on social media. But the protocol required days of observation. In that time, the mother returned, gaunt but alive, and reclaimed her cub. Had they acted too soon, the reunion would have been impossible. "Sometimes patience looks cruel," Eleanor said, "but it's actually mercy." James listened, absorbing the lesson. Later, he would stand in front of his students and frame it this way. Helping isn't about how fast we feel, it's about how wisely we act. That's a truth children can grasp if you give them a story. Each of them carried a private weight into this mission. Eleanor had lost a sibling years earlier to a mountaineering accident. She never forgot the sound of her mother pacing the porch through nights of waiting. William bore survivor's guilt from battles most civilians had forgotten. James wrestled with what it meant to tell children the truth, that not every story ends happily, and yet life is still worth engaging with. In blending these lives, the narrative expands beyond biology. Yes, polar bears hunt seals and navigate pressure ridges, but they also become symbols for our own battles with loss, loyalty, and responsibility. That's what makes this part of the video matter to American viewers. It grounds the wilderness in the familiar. When we talk about conservation, we usually start with data, population counts, habitat maps, trend lines. Those are vital. But without human faces, statistics wither. Eleanor's discipline, William's scars, James's questions, they transform numbers into narrative. And narrative is what compels donations. Votes, petitions, and conversations around family dinner tables. In short, science needs a story to survive. There's also an ethical thread here. Viewers may ask, why focus so much on the people when the bear is the one suffering? The answer is simple but profound, because people are the ones who can choose. Bears don't vote. Bears don't lobby. Bears don't decide to reduce emissions or strengthen wildlife protection. People do. So showing the human cost of compassion, what it does to a responder's sleep. A veteran's stability, a teacher's conscience reminds us that wildlife protection isn't abstract. It's embodied. Service, whether in uniform in classrooms or on icy ridges, leaves marks. Some are medals, some are scars, some are lines in a notebook. But every mark testifies that the badge is not a decoration. It is a covenant. When Eleanor raised hers to show James the chipped edge, she said quietly, "This plastic won't save a cub, but it binds me to try." That sentence could anchor the whole film. As Lady rested her head on William's boot, James asked him why he still volunteered. William didn't look up from the radio. "Because loyalty doesn't retire," he said. For a man who'd once thought his final chapter was a nursing facility bed, that simple declaration was redemption. The mystery running under all this, the one viewers lean into, is whether their combined courage will matter. Can Eleanor's discipline, James's willingness to learn, and William's hard-won wisdom tip the scales for a mother bear? Fighting time and ice, or will they be forced to admit that even badges and loyalty have limits? That unanswered tension is what propels the story forward. And here's the transition that matters. Because while these three lives anchor the human side of the narrative, the ice outside doesn't wait. The drone footage has just shown a flicker of movement near a pressure ridge. Eleanor lifts her radio. James grips his notebook. William straightens in his chair. The story of the vanishing tracks is about to shift into the story of the search. Out on the frozen plain, the mother bear continues her slow, methodical circles. And now, with rescuers ready to follow, the challenge moves from stillness to pursuit. The next step, reading the ice, will decide whether this story turns toward reunion or toward another loss etched in snow. The report came over the radio as a whisper of static. Thermal hit near Ridge 20. Possible movement. Eleanor froze. She looked at James, then at William, whose hand had already gone to Lady's collar, as if the old canine could steady more than just him. Out on the floe, the mother polar bear lifted her head and gave a low huff that carried through the wind. Somewhere beyond the ridge, something stirred. This was the moment when hesitation turned lethal. Every rescuer knew the ice could close in seconds. Leads widened floes, tilted ridges collapsed without warning. Eleanor gathered her gear. "We move," she said. Her voice carried a finality that made James's notebook hand go still. Reading the ice wasn't just about footprints. It was about translating silence into a signal. Eleanor explained as they moved watch the snow ridges. Fresh breaks look blue in the light. That's a weakness. Listen for hollow knocks under your boots. That means water pockets. To James, it felt like learning a language he should have known all along, as if the ice had been speaking, but humans had forgotten how to hear. Thin lines of heat near the ridge, barely distinguishable from cracks in the surface. Could be cubs, could be nothing, Eleanor said. Still they followed. Every step was deliberate boots, pressing flat poles, testing before the weight shifted. William brought up the rear, his eyes not on the ice, but on the team itself. Old soldiers knew that sometimes danger came less from the terrain and more from panic creeping into stride. The mother bear kept her distance, circling parallel, her nose high. She was watching too, measuring whether these strange bipeds would lead her closer to reunion or further into despair. James thought of his students. If he could capture this moment for them, he would tell it like this. Nature leaves clues, but only if you slow down enough to notice. Rushing makes you blind. He remembered a boy in his class who never slowed, who rushed through math, rushed through recess, rushed through grief after his father left. Watching Eleanor test every step, he realized that teaching patience might matter more than any equation. Halfway across the ridge, the radio crackled again. Movement confirmed. 2 small heat signatures. Eleanor exhaled hard. Cubs, still alive. But that exhale wasn't relief. It was pressure, because finding them was only half the battle. Getting them safe was the rest, and the ice would decide how much time they had. Rescuers are trained not to touch unless necessary. If the mother-cub reunion is possible, human scent could ruin everything. So the strategy was surveillance and guidance, not intervention. Eleanor laid out the plan quickly. Flank wide, keep downwind, let the mother make the final approach. "We're not the heroes here," she said. "She is." That sentence stayed with James. In a world where humans like to crown themselves saviors, it was humbling to hear that sometimes the best rescue is simply stepping aside. He thought again of his students, how eager they were to play the hero in stories. Maybe the greater lesson was teaching them to let others lead even when every nerve screamed to take control. The team edged closer. Then came the first sight, a tiny white shape pressed against ice rubble, barely distinguishable from snow. Another shape stirred beside it. The cubs were shivering, eyes wide, muzzles crusted with frost, alive but fading. James's throat tightened. He'd seen children in winter without proper coats, huddled in bus shelters. The posture was the same, a body trying to make itself smaller than the cold. Eleanor raised her hand. "Stop!" They crouched, hearts pounding as the mother bear sniffed the air. She paused, then gave a guttural chuff that reverberated across the flow. Slowly, the cubs raised their heads. One squeaked weak but insistent, and then the mother moved shoulders, rolling forward, snow spraying beneath her paws. She didn't look at the humans again. Her entire being tunneled into the sound of her young. Eleanor whispered, "That's it. That's the reunion." No one breathed until the mother reached them, pressing her nose against each cub, nudging, licking, coaxing them to rise. They toppled into her fur, clinging. The sound that followed was unlike any classroom recording or documentary clip James had ever heard. It was the sound of relief in its rawest form. But the danger wasn't over. The ice groaned, a deep shudder beneath their feet. Eleanor swore softly. "We've got minutes, maybe less." They couldn't interfere, but they could create safe passage. She signaled for William to flank left, James to mark a path with poles. Together they mapped a route back toward thicker flows. Not leading the bear, just clearing confusion, giving her options. Sometimes leadership isn't about being out front, it's about making sure others have a way through. Eleanor's movements were purposeful but never dominant. She didn't wave arms or shout. She laid down guidance, then trusted the mother bear's instincts. Watching James realized that was the same principle behind good teaching. You don't drag students where you want them to go. You clear obstacles so they can find the path themselves. As they backed away, giving space, William murmured to Lady, who sat rigid at his heel. "This is what you taught me too, girl. Trust." Lady's ears flicked, but she stayed motionless, trained years ago never to break position when it mattered most. The cubs stumbled, but the mother guided them across the route the team had marked. Step by step they moved towards safety. The ice still groaned, but it held. For now. Eleanor lowered her radio. "That's all we can do. Now we let her lead." And so they watched as the family disappeared into drifting snow, 3 white figures fading into a horizon that looked endless but wasn't. For viewers, this scene is both a triumph and a warning. Triumph because life had been spared, warning because the fragility of that survival was plain. One more crack, one more gust, and the story could have ended differently. That's what makes Arctic rescues so haunting. They are victories always on the edge of collapse. The ice isn't just geography. It's a character in the story, unpredictable and unforgiving. Conservation too often treats habitat as backdrop, but here, it plays the role of antagonist. The bear fights it, the rescuers read it. Every groan and fracture is dialogue. And like all characters, the ice demands respect. Read your environment before you act. Whether ice classroom or community, ignoring context leads to collapse. His students would hear it not as science, but as wisdom. Look before you leap is not just a proverb, it's survival. As the team retreated, silence returned heavier now. The family was safe for the moment, but Eleanor's jaw stayed tight. She knew how many cubs each year never made it to summer. She knew patience could only go so far when climate and currents pushed faster than any rescue. James closed his notebook. William rubbed Lady's ears, lost in thoughts he didn't voice. Eleanor kept scanning the horizon. None of them celebrated, not yet. Because one reunion didn't erase the larger question, how many families were being torn apart on floes they would never see. And that question, heavy as the Arctic air, led straight into the next challenge. Because rescuing a mother and her cubs was one story. Exposing the forces that profit from broken bonds, whether in kennels, shelters, or black markets, was another. The ice had tested them, while the world beyond the ice would demand even more. As the family faded into the snow, Eleanor whispered, "One fight at a time." But she knew, as did William and James, that another fight waited back on land. A fight not against currents or cracks, but against people who saw animals not as lives, but as currency. The ice had taught them patience. What came next would demand courage. The ice had given back 2 lives that day, maybe 3 if you counted the mother herself. But Eleanor's mind refused to settle. Back at the station, she spread out the files she carried everywhere. Case reports, notes, clippings. Her eyes didn't see the cubs anymore. They saw ledgers, numbers, patterns that didn't fit. Cruelty, she told James quietly, is rarely random. It's organized, it's financed. And like the cracks in sea ice, it spreads in silence until one day you fall straight through. William leaned against the wall. Lady pressed tight to his side. "You think of cruelty as one man with a stick, or one boy who kicks a stray," he said. "But systems, they're worse. They hide behind paperwork." His tone was steady, but James noticed his hand trembled against Lady's fur. Eleanor opened a folder. Inside were photos from a raid 2 years earlier in Montana, rows of kennels hidden behind a livestock auction house. Dogs marked as adopted in local shelter records, yet found chained with fighting scars. Fake euthanasia reports had covered the trail. On paper, she said they were gone. In reality, they were sold. James blinked. He thought of his classroom the way children trusted official notes sent home. If the paper said safe, it meant safe. But who checks the paper, he asked. Eleanor gave him a look that answered the question: almost no one. The economics were brutal in their simplicity. A trained fighting dog could fetch thousands. A single event might generate tens of thousands in betting. Puppies labeled aggressive became bait for training. When Eleanor laid out the numbers $500 for a bait pup, $20,000 in wages on one fight, James felt his stomach turn. These weren't isolated cruelties. They were supply chains. William spoke up. "That's the part the public doesn't get. People think animal abuse is cheap and dirty. Truth is, it's lucrative. Same as narcotics, same as illegal guns. And once money flows, corruption follows. Shelters falsify records. Officers look the other way. Paperwork buries truth." His voice broke, and Lady nudged his hand until he steadied again. The parallel to the polar bear wasn't lost on James. "So the cubs lost on the ice, that's not just nature being harsh." Eleanor shook her head. "Nature is harsh. But cruelty thrives when people decide a life has a price tag. Whether it's a bear cub or a shepherd pup, what disappears isn't just the animal. It's trust." During an undercover sting, FBI agents once infiltrated a dogfighting ring tied to gambling operations across 3 states. They didn't just find dogs. They found forged adoption records, payoffs to local officials, and cash flow that rivaled small businesses. Every scar on a dog's face had an entry line in someone's ledger, Eleanor said. And every bet placed kept the cycle alive. The mystery isn't why cruelty exists. That part is predictable. The mystery is why communities tolerate it. William gave his answer because complicity feels safer than confrontation. Neighbors hear cries. They tell themselves someone else will call. They see a dog chained in a yard and say, maybe it's fine. Same way we watch ice melt on the news and think someone smarter will fix it. James thought of the cubs huddled against the snow rubble. Survival had required their mother to act, not to wait for another bear. Maybe humans needed to relearn that lesson, respond now, not later. Cruelty isn't just about harm, it's about the decision to look away. His students would understand that. Every child had seen a classmate bullied and had faced the choice to intervene or not. The scale was different, but the principle was identical. Eleanor pushed a different angle, one that startled even James. Animals can't testify, but their scars can. That's why documenting matters. Photos, vet reports, video, they turn silence into evidence. Courts won't convict on sympathy, they convict on proof. She flipped to another page, a canine retirement case where the dog's documented service record paired with abuse evidence had swayed a jury. Should animals themselves be considered victims with rights? Or just property like stolen cars? In many states, William explained the law still treated them as the latter. Bella saved 37 lives in service, took bullets in the line of duty. And when her time ended, the system filed her under asset disposal. That's not just broken, that's betrayal. His voice cracked again, and Lady rested her chin on his knee as if to remind him he wasn't speaking alone. James scribbled furiously in his notebook. Someday he wanted his students to debate that question: are animals evidence or are they victims? The answer mattered not just in law, but in conscience. The economic thread wove through every part of this. Eleanor showed James a chart, how a single fighting dog's offspring could generate revenue for years. How shelters became unwitting supply hubs when oversight failed. How betting apps disguised as sports forums laundered wages. It wasn't just a dark corner of society. It was a marketplace. People think cruelty is hidden, Eleanor said. But it's not. It's advertised in code. It's financed like any other enterprise. And if you follow the money, you see how wide the cracks are. William added the human cost. He told James about veterans who came home to find their service dogs abandoned, sold, or euthanized because pensions couldn't cover care. Imagine fighting for your country, then watching the partner who saved your life treated as disposable inventory. His jaw clenched. That's an economy too. Not of money, but of neglect. The room fell silent. James looked down at his notes, then at Eleanor, then at William. He finally asked the question that had been building since they found the cubs. So what do we do? How do we break it? Eleanor didn't hesitate. You shine light, you document, you refuse to be silent. Cruelty hides in shadows. Our job is to drag it out. For the audience, this is the bridge. The story of two polar bear cubs on the ice becomes a doorway into understanding that every act of cruelty ripples outward into economics, into law, into community complicity. Saving one family is a victory, but dismantling the systems that profit from suffering is the real battle. Cruelty is scalable. So is compassion. The same networks that move animals through black markets could, with different choices, move them into sanctuaries. The same neighbors who ignore cries could rally donations. The same media that fuels outrage for clicks could fund rescues with campaigns. The question is not whether systems exist. The question is which system we build. William leaned forward. When I held my partner bleeding out, I promised her I'd never let her sacrifice to go to waste. That promise didn't end when the bullet wounds healed. It doesn't end when the pension runs out. Loyalty doesn't expire. Lady licked his hand, sealing the vow. James closed his notebook. So this isn't just about bears or dogs, he said softly. It's about us deciding what loyalty looks like when nobody's watching. Eleanor nodded. Exactly. And the first step is admitting how deep the cracks run. Outside, the wind howled across the station's siding, echoing the groan of ice they'd heard hours earlier. The cubs were safe for now, but Eleanor knew the bigger fractures lay inland, in ledgers, in laws, in silence. And those would be harder to mend than any frozen ridge. The files on Eleanor's table weren't just records, they were maps of a hidden battlefield. To confront it, they would need more than patience and loyalty. They would need investigation, undercover work, and a law strong enough to match cruelty's reach. The ice had tested their caution. Now the system itself would test their courage. The morning after the cubs' rescue, James logged on to his school laptop to upload field notes. What he hadn't expected was the flood of notifications. A volunteer had posted a short clip, the polar bear mother nudging her cubs upright, snow spraying as they clung to her fur. No captions, just 30 seconds of survival. By dawn, it had been viewed 1 million times. By noon, hashtags trended. Justice for cubs. Save our ice heroes on the floes. Eleanor frowned when she saw the clip. "I didn't authorize this," she muttered. But she didn't shut the screen, because while the video exposed their work, it also awakened something larger than protocol. Comments poured in from every corner, parents watching with children, veterans recalling their service dogs, and students begging to do fundraisers. Outrage and tenderness braided into a single rope of attention. William read the comments silently. One struck him hard. If a mother bear can fight for her cubs, what excuse do we have for not fighting corruption? He hadn't spoken about Prairie Pines, the nursing facility, where neglect had nearly broken him, but strangers seemed to be naming it for him. Lady nudged his hand as if reminding him, "This is why you came back." Eleanor called a meeting. "The public eye is on us now. That's power, but it's dangerous. Once stories hit the net, they can turn sentimental, then vanish." She pointed to James's notebook. "We need facts, not just feelings." James understood. His students lived in a swirl of viral clips. Today's outrage became tomorrow's meme. "So how do we make it stick?" he asked. Eleanor's reply was sharp. "By making sure the story doesn't stay just about cubs. It's about systems, corruption, survival. Everyone needs to see their reflection in this ice." And they did. Within hours, media vans rolled into the small town that bordered the station. Reporters crowded the diner, flashing photos of the cubs across flat-screen TVs. Neighbors who had once muttered someone should do something now spoke loudly about how proud they were of their community. It was classic bystander psychology. The moment cameras turned on, silence cracked. William leaned against the diner counter, lady sitting straight as a sentinel. A young reporter asked him why he cared so much about a bear. His voice was quiet but carried, "Because I know what it's like to be abandoned after service, and I promised I'd never let it happen again to anyone." The clip aired that evening. Within hours, veterans groups flooded forums with solidarity messages. Donations began streaming toward sanctuaries. But Eleanor knew attention was fickle. She told James a story to drive the point home. Years earlier, a shelter had been caught funneling aggressive dogs into fighting circuits. Photos had gone viral, scarred muzzles, pleading eyes. Hashtags burned hot. For 2 weeks, protests filled the streets. But then another scandal stole headlines and the shelter quietly reopened under new management. The dogs didn't trend anymore, Eleanor said, so they disappeared all over again. Visibility isn't victory. Outrage must be shepherded into action or it dissolves. James wrote that in his notebook, underlined twice. He thought of how often his students' energy fizzled once recess ended. Without structure, even the fiercest cries fade. The fresh perspective came from watching the town itself shift. At first, neighbors praised from the sidelines. But when petitions circulated and donation jars appeared, they faced a choice: remain spectators or become participants. And choices reveal character. The same grocery clerk who once ignored William's quiet suffering now taped a #JusticeForCubs flyer to her window. The same mechanic who had said someone should open his wallet. Transformation wasn't instant, but it was visible. William noticed it too. "Funny," he murmured. "It takes a bear on ice to remind folks about loyalty at home." He thought of Prairie Pines again, how staff walked past rooms pretending not to hear veterans calling out. The parallel was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Neglect thrives in silence, whether in nursing homes or icy ridges. James found himself fielding interviews he never sought. One journalist asked what he'd tell children about the cubs. He answered carefully that survival is a team effort. The mother didn't give up. The rescuers didn't rush. And when the world finally watched, they had a choice to share a clip or to share responsibility. That soundbite spread almost as fast as the cub video itself. Social media swelled with images. Kids drawing polar bears, obies for class projects, families donating grocery money, activists staging ice block vigils in city squares. The story became more than wildlife, it became a metaphor. The cubs stood in for every vulnerable being waiting on the edge of survival. Yet, beneath the swell of attention, Eleanor warned about the bystander problem. Clicks feel like action, she said, but they're not. Sharing isn't saving. She recounted how during an undercover sting, FBI agents had tracked hundreds of social media accounts that shared dog-fight footage under the guise of awareness. View counts soared, but raids came too late for many dogs. The line between witness and participant blurs online, she explained. We must guard it. James brought the discussion back to his students. They think posting is a protest. Maybe I need to teach them that posting is just the beginning. Eleanor nodded. Teach them that silence isn't neutral. It sides with harm. The town meeting that night proved the point. Residents filled the community hall, some carrying handmade signs, others just out of curiosity. Eleanor spoke first, laying out facts about the bear rescue and corruption in shelters. William followed, telling his story about Bella and his vow of loyalty. Silence fell heavy when he admitted how close he'd come to losing both his dog and his dignity to a system that chose profit over people. And then James stepped forward. He held up his notebook. I've written pages these past days, he said, but what matters isn't my notes. It's what each of you chooses after tonight. You saw the cubs. You felt their fear. Now the question is, what will you do with that feeling? The hall erupted in murmurs, then in commitments. People pledged donations, volunteers signed up for sanctuary shifts, and teenagers offered to organize awareness events. When media and hashtags meet, lived testimony. Passivity cracks. Strangers turn into stakeholders. A polar bear cub becomes a mirror, forcing townsfolk to see their own habits of silence. And in that mirror, some choose to change. By midnight, the hashtags had evolved. Not just justice for cubs, but no more silence, every life counts, from ice to action. Outrage was shifting into organized will. Still, Eleanor tempered hope. She told the team momentum must be harnessed, otherwise it melts like snow. Her eyes flicked to William. He nodded slowly. Then we harness it. Loyalty doesn't retire, and neither does duty. As James walked back to his cabin, he considered what to tell his class. Maybe he would show them the cub clip, yes, but paired with the image of townsfolk signing pledges. He would say, feeling isn't enough. Courage is what happens after feeling. That was a lesson children could carry into any playground, any life. The cubs had been saved by their mother's persistence and by a team's restraint. But the larger story, the one that rippled through media and town halls, was about waking from bystander slumber. Cruelty's economy thrived on silence. Compassion's economy needed sound, loud, organized, persistent. The town had stirred, the media had amplified. But attention is fragile, and systems of cruelty are stubborn. The next test would not be measured in hashtags or meetings, but in whether survivors of trauma, human and animal, could be trained to build futures stronger than their scars. And that meant turning to the work of healing through training. Snow still clung to the shoreline, but inside the small training yard behind the sanctuary, spring stirred. James leaned against the fence, notebook open, watching 5 German Shepherd pups tumble across the grass. Their paws were too big for their bodies, their play clumsy, but there was something steady in their eyes. These weren't ordinary pups. They had been born into fear, pulled from a system that treated them as currency, and now they were being prepared for something better. William sat nearby, lady at his side. His cane rested against the bench, but his posture was alert. Every bark, every stumble, every tiny success the pups made drew his gaze. He had trained partners before dogs who had sniffed out narcotics, tracked suspects, even pulled civilians from wreckage. This was different. These pups were training not for battle, but for healing. Eleanor walked into the yard carrying cones and a bag of clickers. Today, she said, they start public access basics. Heal sight, ignore distractions. She scattered the cones in a rough pattern, then crouched to call the smallest pup a female with a crooked ear. Faith, she said softly. Let's show them what patience looks like. The pup wobbled toward her, tail wagging, then sat almost on cue. The clicker snapped. A treat followed. James scribbled furiously. He'd show this to his students. Not the polished perfection of service dogs on videos, but the raw beginning shaky paws, missed cues, handlers kneeling in mud. The lesson wasn't that service came naturally. It was through practice that resilience grew through practice. William leaned down to Lady. "Remember your first drills, girl?" Lady thumped her tail as if acknowledging the memory. His eyes softened. "She taught me patience too. I thought I was training her. Truth is, she was training me." That reversal was the mystery most people missed. Healing doesn't flow one way. Survivors, whether human or animal, teach those who try to help them. Eleanor explained it as she guided another pup through the cone maze. They've known trauma. You can't erase it, but you can channel it. See how he hesitates at sudden noise? That hyper-awareness with the right training becomes life-saving intuition in allergen detection or seizure response. James nodded. It reminded him of his students who struggled with anxiety. Their sensitivity, often treated as a weakness, could become a strength if nurtured. He wrote, "What wounds you can also guide you." The sanctuary director, Sarah, joined them clipboard in hand. She outlined benchmarks pups would need to pass public access tests, calm in crowds, steady near sirens, focused despite distractions. Each had potential placements lined up, diabetic alert seizure detection therapy in schools. But placement only happens, she reminded them, if we do the hard work now. William listened quietly, then spoke. Hard work is fine. What breaks dogs isn't challenge, it's abandonment. Don't promise them a future you can't keep. His words landed heavily. He had lived that truth. Training wasn't limited to the pups. William himself was undergoing a different program. The VA counselor visited twice a week, guiding him through exposure exercises. Crowds still set his nerves on edge. Sudden bangs still triggered flashbacks, but Lady, ever the professional, alerted before panic consumed him. At night, when memories clawed too deep, she pressed across his chest, grounding him. Eleanor watched William with respect. He's proof, she told James, that healing is partnership. Trauma isolates. Training reconnects. She gestured toward the pups. That's what they'll do for someone else one day, anchor them back to the world. James found the parallel obvious. The polar bear mother had trained her cubs on the ice, nudging them to rise, guiding them across fragile ridges. Now these pups were learning the same lesson: survival is taught, not assumed, and humans had to learn it too. One pup scout startled badly at the crack of a dropped clipboard. Instead of scolding, she crouched low, clicked softly, and rewarded him for creeping forward again. That right there, she explained, is how you teach a survivor not to freeze forever. You don't punish fear, you reward courage. James wrote it down for his class. Don't punish fear. Reward courage. He knew it applied to children stumbling through their own hardships. Healing isn't fast. It's repetitive, often boring, and sometimes frustrating. But in the dailiness of practice, sitting, healing, trying again, trust is rebuilt. Survivors, whether cubs, pups, or veterans, don't need grand rescues every day. They need a steady presence. Eleanor put it another way. Hope isn't a miracle, it's muscle memory. Every time a pup chose focus over fear, it laid down a new groove in its brain. Every time William endured a public outing without bolting, he carved a path back toward freedom. The cubs on the ice had survived because their mother repeated the chuff that said, "Rise, follow, try again." The rhythm of survival is repetition. Training isn't about erasing scars. It's about using them. The pups that flinched at shadows learned to notice what others missed. William's hyper-alertness, once a burden, became vigilance that kept his community safer. Even the polar bear mother's fierce protectiveness, born of loss, made her cubs stronger. Survival skills reframed can become service skills. The sanctuary opened training sessions to the public once a week. Neighbors came, drawn first by curiosity, then by commitment. Children lined fences cheering when a pup ignored a dropped plate of food. Teenagers volunteered as distraction teams, riding skateboards past calmly sitting shepherds. The town that once looked away was now practicing presence. Compassion was becoming community muscle memory. The media picked up these moments too. Clips of Scout calmly alerting to a hidden peanut jar went viral. Headlines read, "Once destined for cruelty, now training to save allergic kids." Donations surged again. Hashtags shifted from trauma to trust healing pause training. Tomorrow. James saw the danger of sentimentality, but also its potential. If properly guided, the same attention that once fueled dogfighting rings could finance sanctuaries. Economies aren't just money, he told his students later. They're habits. The more we choose to invest in healing, the less room cruelty has to grow. William grew quieter as weeks passed, but stronger too. One evening he stood in the yard watching pups practice their sits. "I spent years thinking scars ruined me," he admitted. "Turns out they trained me for loyalty I wouldn't trade for anything." He looked down at Lady, and she taught me that scars don't end a story. They start a new chapter. The pups stumbled, corrected, tried again. Their progress mirrored William's. And James realized that what united them all, the bear cubs on the ice, the shepherd pups in training, the veteran learning to breathe again, was the same truth. Survival is not enough. Healing must teach. Because only when lessons are passed on does survival ripple outward into change. As dusk fell, Eleanor called the final command. The pups sat lined like a crooked row of soldiers. Some straight, some slouched, all watching their handlers with wide eyes. Eleanor smiled. "They'll make it," she said. "Not perfectly, but enough to save lives." And that was the takeaway viewers needed. Not every survivor becomes flawless. Not every scar fades. But with patience, training, and loyalty, even the most broken beginnings can grow into service, into healing that teaches others how to help. The sanctuary yard grew quiet as stars pricked through twilight. The pups curled into sleep. Lady at William's feet, James still scribbling notes. Eleanor locked the gate, her eyes on the horizon. Healing was underway, but beyond the fence, the fight against corruption was far from finished. The next challenge would test whether systems, not just individuals, could change. The courtroom smelled faintly of wood polish and nerves. William shifted in his chair. Lady resting at his boots, her vest marked clearly, "Service dog, do not distract." He had testified before about comrades in combat, but never about a partner with 4 legs. Today was different. Eleanor sat behind him, files stacked in neat columns, photographs tagged and labeled. James held his notebook like a shield, pages filled with the kind of details reporters overlooked. Quiet gestures, tremors in hands, pauses in breath. The case wasn't about cubs on the ice or pups in training. It was about proving in the eyes of the law that lives like theirs mattered beyond sentiment. The prosecutor rose, a voice calm but steady. "This court will hear evidence of falsified euthanasia records of dogs diverted to fighting rings of sanctuaries denied funding while corrupt officials grew rich. But at the heart of this case is one question: are these animals property or are they victims? That question hung heavier than the judge's gavel. Because on paper, most states still treated dogs, bears, even endangered animals, as assets. Things that could be owned, bought, and disposed of. Yet William knew better. He remembered Bella dragging him from the wreckage, remembered Lady waking him from night terrors. Tools don't do that. Partners do. Eleanor presented her files. Photos of pups marked adopted but later found chained. Scans of records showing dogs euthanized with no cremation logs. Bank deposits in suspicious amounts. It was meticulous, clinical. Yet what made the jury lean forward wasn't paper. It was story. William's scars, Lady's steady eyes, the clip of the cubs clinging to their mother in blowing snow. James later wrote in his notebook, "Evidence proves. Stories persuade. Together they convict." Years earlier, an FBI sting had recorded a shelter director boasting that retired canines were worth more in the pit than in the park. The dog in question had once located missing children. In court, the dog's record was read aloud, 37 lives saved. Then, photos of his body scarred from fights. The jury convicted not just on law, but on outrage. Yet outrage raised another question: should animals testify? Not with words, but with presence. Ladies calm in the courtroom, the scars on rescued pups, the footage of polar bear cubs trembling on the ice. Eleanor argued yes. Their bodies are evidence, but their lives are testimony. To see them is to hear them. Dogs cannot testify. They lack intent, awareness, oath. The judge allowed the animals' presence anyway, not as witnesses, but as living exhibits. The line blurred. The ethical question sharpened. When do we stop treating them as property and start honoring them as victims with voices? William whispered to James during recess. I used to think testimony meant words, but when Lady presses against my leg in panic, that's testimony too. She's saying, I see your fear, I won't leave you. If I understand it, why can't the law? Silence does not mean absence of truth. Many who suffer, children, animals, the voiceless, communicate outside language. The task of justice is to listen anyway. Eleanor gave a fresh perspective during the closing arguments. We allow service dogs in courtrooms to calm victims. We award medals to canines who save lives. Yet when those same animals are abused, we demote them to property on a spreadsheet. That contradiction isn't the law, it's blindness. The jury deliberated long, but not endlessly. Guilty. Fraud, cruelty, racketeering. For once, evidence and ethics aligned. Reporters flooded the steps, microphones flashing. James spoke carefully. The verdict isn't just for these animals. It's a mirror for us. Who we choose to protect defines who we are. Public reaction roared online. Hashtags exploded again. Voices for the voiceless animals are victims. Loyalty deserves law. Donations surged to sanctuaries. Congress aides requested Eleanor's files. Even school children mailed drawings of bears and shepherds with captions, "They saved us. We must save them." But Eleanor tempered the celebration. Conviction punishes a man. Change requires a system. She explained to James how some states were drafting laws. Animal victims given legal advocates in court, mandatory retirement funds for canines, and harsher penalties for falsifying shelter records. It's progress, she admitted, but fragile. William, tired but resolute, added, Loyalty doesn't retire. Neither should justice. The ethical mystery lingered. If animals can't swear an oath, can they still tell the truth? If they can't claim rights, can we claim them on their behalf? Eleanor believed yes. William, scarred by both battle and bureaucracy, believed yes. James wrote it as a question for his students. Who speaks for those who can't speak for themselves? And what does our answer say about us? This wasn't just courtroom drama. It was a blueprint. Because just as ice cracks reveal hidden fractures, so did the law reveal how much cruelty hid behind property definitions. And just as the cubs survived only by their mother's persistence, justice for animals would only survive by human persistence. Animals don't need to become human to deserve dignity. Their loyalty, their service, and their suffering already testify. Our legal systems don't grant them humanity. They grant us humanity when we choose to hear. As the courthouse emptied, William stood slowly, leaning on his cane. Lady Rose was with him, as she always had. Cameras clicked, reporters shouted. He ignored them. Instead, he bent to stroke her muzzle. We spoke for you today, he whispered, but you've spoken for us every day. James tucked away his notebook, heavy with words he knew children needed. Eleanor gathered her files, already thinking of the next fight. The trial was over, but the question it raised could not be boxed. Who speaks for animals? The answer had to ripple outward into classrooms, into laws, into the choices of every bystander. Outside the courthouse, the crowd cheered, hashtags blazed, and donations poured in. But William knew, noise fades. What endures is transformation. The quiet decision to keep showing up, to keep training, to keep speaking. And so, as dusk fell, the story edged toward its final chapter. The emotional payoff where scars meet hope and loyalty becomes legacy. Snow fell again in the morning. William walked the sanctuary path with Lady at his side. The pups were older now, no longer clumsy balls of fur, but steady-footed apprentices. In the distance, the polar bear mother and her cubs still patrolled the flow, captured in a framed wildlife photography print that hung in the sanctuary's main hall. It reminded everyone why they had begun and why they could not stop. Eleanor was there too, speaking softly into her phone, answering calls from state legislators. James stood under the awning with his students who had traveled north for a field trip. Their faces pressed to the glass as they watched puppies practice detection drills. The long winter hadn't ended, but it had become a bridge connecting despair to duty, cruelty to compassion, isolation to community. The payoff wasn't flashy. It was quiet. A boy with severe allergies meets Scout for the first time, and Scout alerts before the peanut jar is even opened. A veteran stroking a therapy dog's fur while recounting memories he had never dared to share before. A neighbor who once walked by in silence is now standing watch during evening feedings. William bent down slowly, his hand resting on Lady's head. "We all get broken," he told James's class. "But broken doesn't mean useless. It means we're ready to be reshaped." His words held weight. He had lived the fracture of abandonment and the rebuilding of loyalty. Survival alone is never the end of the story. Healing must ripple outward. A polar bear mother teaches her cubs to rise after a collapse. A German shepherd pup learns to steady her breathing after fear. A veteran learns to walk again into crowds. And each lesson carries forward to the next cub, the next pup, the next human who needs a partner. That chain is what turns a long winter into a bridge. Take Scout's example. He began as a trembling pup, flinching at every sound. Weeks of training, repetition, and patient handlers reshaped fear into vigilance. Now his hyper-awareness saves children before allergic reactions spiral into emergencies. Trauma didn't vanish. It transformed. Viewers can recognize the same in themselves. Wounds are not endpoints. They are raw material for service. Loyalty doesn't retire. He said it when Lady nudged him awake from nightmares. He said it when children asked why service dogs couldn't just be pets. He said it when lawmakers questioned why funding for canine retirement mattered. And each time the words reminded listeners that service has no expiration date when rooted in love. Ecosystems and communities mirror each other. When sea ice fractures, cubs vanish. When oversight collapses, shelters corrupt. When neighbors stay silent, cruelty thrives. But when currents shift, when records are kept honestly, when communities show up, life rebounds. Conservation law, education, even grief. They all demand the same discipline, consistent presence. For James, the emotional payoff came when one of his students asked, "Do you think the cubs know we cared?" He paused, then answered, "Maybe not us, but they know their mother never gave up, and that's enough." In that moment he realized teaching wasn't about giving answers. It was about giving children reasons to care, so they would one day be the ones who show up. Eleanor's payoff was different. She stood in front of lawmakers, holding up photos of cubs huddled on the ice and of pups now working as service dogs. Her voice didn't shake. "If we can protect banks with laws," she said, "we can protect lives that give us loyalty without asking anything in return." Applause followed, but she didn't measure success in claps. She measured it in statutes passed in budgets, redirected in fewer falsified records, crossing her desk. And William's payoff was the most personal. Sitting in the sanctuary cottage with Lady and the pups, he whispered, "We didn't just survive. We built something better." The scars across his body still ached in cold weather. His nightmares didn't vanish. But loyalty anchored him, and he knew his life's closing chapter wasn't abandonment, it was legacy. The long winter never truly ends. Every generation inherits storms, ice-melting corruption, brewing, silence, tempting. But each winter can become a bridge if enough hands pause and hearts decide to keep building. What rescues cubs on the ice today can rescue children in classrooms tomorrow. What heals one veteran with a service dog can ripple into policies that protect thousands. Cruelty scales, but so does compassion. A small act, signing a petition, volunteering an hour, refusing to stay silent, echoes farther than we see. If silence fuels cruelty, sound fuels healing. Each voice matters. The call to action is simple, but it begins inside. Ask yourself, where in your own life have you been a bystander? Who or what has pressed against the bars while you walked past, and what would it mean for you to stop to notice, to choose loyalty over silence? Maybe your answer is donating to a wildlife rescue or animal sanctuary. Maybe it's mentoring a child or checking in on a neighbor who seems forgotten. Maybe it's pressing record on your phone when you witness cruelty or pressing share when a story like the Cubs needs to be heard. Every choice is a brick in the bridge, so here is your invitation. Carry the lessons of the polar bear mother, the rescued pups, the veteran and his shepherd into your own long winter. Decide what bridge you'll help build. And if this story has given you reason to reflect, reason to act, or simply reason to hope, stay with us. Like this video, subscribe for more wild animal stories and join a community that refuses to let loyalty be forgotten. Because the long winter is not the end. It is the bridge. And we cross it together.